Hello, greetings everyone. I'm the Reverend Jill Olds, the director of the Yale Youth Ministry Institute at Yale Divinity School. The YMI is very pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar entitled Empowering Young People Towards Beloved Community with the Reverend Dr. Montague Williams. This is our final gathering for this year's lecture series, which we've coined Thriving, Not Surviving, building a toolkit for a flourishing youth ministry in 2021 to 2022. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us before, and a very special welcome to all of you who are joining our community for the first time. We're very glad to have you with us. For those from a Muslim tradition of Ramadan Mubarak to you. For those from the Christian tradition, we hope and pray that the upcoming Holy Week is indeed a holy time for you. This past year, we've been grateful to have offered opportunities to hear from speakers who have taken what the past 2 years has been and have used it to inform and transform their work with young people. Each of our presenters brings a unique perspective and experience, and all of them hold a piece to the puzzle that will help us answer the question, how can my youth ministry not just survive, but actually thrive? We will be returning to an in-person gathering in May, and if you have not done so yet, I invite you to register for that gathering. It's on May 7th. We will be hosting the Reverend Dr. Kenda Creasy-Dean from Princeton Theological Seminary and the Reverend Matt Overton. Kenda and Matt will together explore church innovation, and specifically innovation in youth ministry with us in a day-long seminar that will take place on the YDS campus. Kenda's reputation always precedes her. We've had her speak with us a number of times. And some of you may also remember Matt from when he came to us last year about his work in seeing youth ministry as a social enterprise by creating youth ministry nonprofits rooted in his local congregation. Again, this will be on Saturday, May 7th at YDS, and you can find a registration link for that in your chat window. Our office has a great staff, and I'd like to introduce them to you quickly and thank them for their work. We fall under the purview of the Center for Continuing Education at YDS. So we have Kelly Morrissey, the Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Ed. And we're blessed to have Megan Lukens, our Communications Coordinator. Thank you both for all that you do, and more importantly, for who you are. If you are new to us, we invite you to peruse our website when you get a free chance. That is YaleYouthMinistryInstitute.org. You'll be able to find that in your chat box as well. We have a whole array of resources on there. Curricula for your youth, training modules for youth leaders. We have discussion forums, over 1,000 video clips and lectures given by leading youth ministry experts. We have COVID-era resources. We have tips for resilience with youth, anti-racism work with youth, links to other articles and materials. There's a lot on there, and it's all available to you for free. So we invite you to please do check out our website. And now it is my deep pleasure to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Montague Williams. Dr. Williams is the professor of church, culture, and society at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, California. He is an ordained minister and holds a PhD in theological studies from Boston University. With a background in congregational pastoral leadership and campus chaplaincy, his research and teaching focus on the intersection of theology, ethics, and Christian ministry. Along with journal and magazine articles, he is the author of Church in Color, Youth Ministry, Race, and the Theology of Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Dr. Williams, welcome. We are beyond honored to have you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I am looking forward to this conversation with each of you. I'm going to take a moment and share my screen so that we can get on the same page here really quickly. So let me do that. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah. Okay, great. I come to this conversation from a variety of experiences and questions, and I am looking forward to continuing those conversations with you here. I want to tell you a couple things. One, what we will be engaging today seeks to engage the book Church in Color, and I know not everyone has read that book. In many ways, what we're doing today is looking at some practical implications in light of that research. If you just want a quick overview of that, you could quickly just see that it is a book that brings together empirical research among young people and congregations and puts that in dialogue with theological research around Kingian understanding. And in there, there's a lot to deal with in terms of theological formation and theological understandings. Our time together today is not going to be spent doing a whole lot of that, but I do want you to know that in the Q&A, if you find yourself thinking, well, how does this connect? We can definitely engage that there. Or if you thought, I think I want to read more, I want to hear a little bit more about where this comes from or why these practical implications could matter, you can engage that book as well. I also want to tell you something here. This conversation is not just about me talking at you. If we were in person, you know that half the joy is being at a table with friends and new friends and getting to converse. And of course, on Zoom, we try to do our best with that. And one of the things that we do have are breakout rooms. Now, it's possible that some of you might think to yourself, if we're doing a breakout room, I'm out of here. I am going to jump off this thing before I have to say anything. Let me just tell you, for the breakout rooms, you do not have to turn on your camera. You do not have to say anything profound. You don't have to act like you even enjoy the presentation so far. You could spend the time just doing whatever you want there, but I want to encourage you to be a part of that so that no one is left alone in the breakout room that they're assigned. And I encourage you to just, at the very least, engage them as a fellow human being. Let me give you a quick heads up. If you're trying to think through, like, how can I prepare for this breakout discussion? I want you to just think about this. As we get into the conversation around critical storytelling, I ask you to think to yourself, what aspects of critical storytelling seem important or intriguing to me? And where have I encountered critical storytelling? Okay, that's just a heads up. Now you're thinking, what is critical storytelling? And that is the point. I am excited to talk about that with you. Let me once again just say today's presentation focuses primarily on fostering conversation around practical implications in church and color for your own context of youth work. And here's what our time together will look like. We'll talk about the concept of beloved community. We'll talk about the work of empowering. We'll talk about critical storytelling. We'll then have a breakout room discussion, and you'll talk about those things I just mentioned. We'll get back together, and then we'll look at some examples and pathways to critical storytelling. We'll have another brief breakout session, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And once again, that Q&A can go a variety of directions. Whenever I open up conversation in the broad presentation time, if I ever say, oh, can someone tell me what you're thinking about this? Feel free to use the hand raising emoji that's on your, should be towards the bottom or the top, depending on how you have your Zoom set up. You can use that. And then I'll just call on you there. There's one time towards the beginning where I will do that. Okay. All right. Let's get in this together. Many of you have heard of the concept of beloved community. Perhaps some of you even came to this session thinking, I want to go to this because it's talking about beloved community, and like, that's my jam, like that's what I do. That's great. I come at the conversation specifically from a Kingian understanding. That's my area of research. For King, beloved community is a term that he used to describe this vision of eschatological hope, but not some sort of escape. It's not for King some other world that you are waiting to get to. Rather, it's this eschatological hope that's embodied here and now. And that's crucial. That's very important. For King, this hope, it guides his expectations of what's possible, and it cultivates a practice of courage. Now, what does this look like? Well, for King, it refers to this realization of a society of love and justice and peace and freedom. And the idea here is that this is what human beings were created for. This is what life is about. If someone were to ask, what does it mean to be human? From a Kingian take, you can't separate that from this concept of beloved community. It's not only the kind of life that human beings were created for King, his understanding is that this is the kind of life that we're heading toward. And so it becomes for King a sort of teleological or end-based framework that shapes what he does in the here and now. Because this is our hope, because this is where we're going, because this is possible, we can practice it here and now, even in the face of a great deal of opposition. That's how it creates courage. It's the kind of community that intentionally rejects injustice in all of its intersecting forms. That's huge. For King, he comes at the conversation around injustice through the lens of race and racism, but from there he sees intersecting points. And those intersections can keep going as we become more and more aware of injustice. He highlighted three main forms of injustice, racism and materialism, sometimes called poverty, depending on where he talks about that, and then war or militarism, depending on where he talks about that. But those three parts of intersection were crucial for him. But as we do Kingian work, we can see those intersections spread further. Beloved community is not just a whole lot of, here's what I have to do. Beloved community is also a way of seeing and sensing in the world. Beloved community is something that calls for a new imagination. And when we embrace it, when we embody it together, it actually creates the possibility of seeing new things take place. It lets us know that another way is possible, that injustice doesn't have to be the way. In my book, I look at this particularly with what young people are experiencing with race and racism. I found that it's difficult for congregations to embrace beloved community, primarily because it's difficult for congregations to be honest about the realities of race. It's so complicated. What I found in the book, what I talk about is that in the congregations I studied, as much as they actually mean well and they're doing great work, they do tend, at least the ones that the framework that I looked at in the book, congregations do at times tend to undermine or dismiss or underestimate, forget stories of race and racism in the work of discipleship. There tends to be, especially depending on the tradition and the context, there tends to be a desire to imagine church space as beyond the realities of racism. Sometimes this is done to try to preserve an assumed sense of innocence among young people. But what we find is young people don't have that. It's an imagined sense of innocence around racism. In fact, young people are longing for meaningful interaction, longing for a way to engage it. They're longing to know where God is in all of it. For King, beloved community is definitely tied to love and justice, courage, and hope. He says, you see, as long as love is around, God is alive. As long as justice is around, God is alive. We find that you can't think about beloved community and King without this intersecting work of love, justice, hope, and courage. We'll get back to that in a minute. Empowering. We're talking about the work of empowering young people. I think it's important just to take a moment to just discuss what that means. Sometimes maybe in the workplace, someone says, I'm going to empower you to do this. And what they mean is, I'm going to put all of this on your plate. See you later. That's not what we're talking about here. at all. To empower is to give someone or some people the authority or power to do something. Empowering is not simply placing responsibility for justice on young people. Empowering is creating interactive space for young people to challenge assumptions, to lead, to try, to make mistakes, to learn, to contribute ideas, and to discern vocation on the journey toward beloved community. Theologically, from a Christian perspective and from King's particular theological perspective, this work is the work of empowering trust that God is active and alive in the world. King talked about the Holy Spirit through different language. Some places he talked about the Holy Spirit as the Holy Spirit. Sometimes he talked about the Holy Spirit as this unifying force of love in the world. For King, all of this work around beloved community falls apart if we think that it's just us creating this thing on our own. Rather than that, it's this deep trust that the creator of all things is present and active and guiding and a part of that dance with us and a part of that dance with young people on this journey towards beloved community. Okay. Now let me clarify something important for you. In the last chapter of Church in Color, I offer a framework that brings together 3 areas of practice: critical storytelling, collaborative somebodiness, and cruciform creativity. Today, we are talking about critical storytelling. Perhaps at some other time, we can engage collaborative somebodiness and cruciform creativity, but today, we're focusing specifically on critical storytelling. What I argue in the book is that you actually need these 3 areas of intertwining practice to form the kind of community with young people that bears witness, that becomes a testimony of beloved community, especially in a context that is afraid to name the realities of racism and confused about what to do with it. All right. Now, I'm going to read through this definition of critical storytelling, and then I'm going to ask you, any of you, hopefully about 3 of you, to just raise your hand, that digital hand, and tell me what stands out to you in this definition. What do you find meaningful about it or important? Okay. Critical storytelling involves a community of committed narrators and listeners who give each other freedom to share significant life situations in their own voices and encourage one another to become increasingly aware of social injustices, personal biases, and new possibilities. All right. As you read through that, is there anything that stands out to you as worth highlighting? I see Susan raising her hand.
Own voices.
Own voices. Indeed. It's so important that I just want you to know, Amy, I will call on you in just a moment. It's so important that critical storytelling allow young people to discern what their own voice is in the conversation. It's easy at times to do the interpreting work for young people and place it on them. Sometimes active listening creates an unfortunate move of reshaping. So the work of critical storytelling is that ongoing work to make sure that what we're hearing is what young people are really trying to say. Now, it's important to also know that there's room for a variety of people to participate in critical storytelling. But if we're talking about it, through the lens of young people, it's so significant that the things that they bring to the table, the things that they're carrying, gets to be a part of the way they tell the story. Amy.
I was struck by the inclusion of, specific, the word narrator and listener. I think, that's important to have both named, and, in storytelling, there's a lot more listeners than narrators usually, but I still think it's really important to name the two.
That's right. Yes, there has to be committed narrators and listeners, committed, because when we get into critical storytelling, sometimes what's told is not what people want to hear. And so there has to be a commitment toward beloved community. There has to be a commitment to allowing this to be part of our story and not just their story. And that work of listening is that inviting space. Like this is changing our usness. Is there anyone else? Oh, Kimberly, sure.
So for me, as an aspiring storyteller, community gives each other freedom to share. To me, that signifies that the role of storyteller can change, because I may be telling the story, but it's in my voice and it's the way I want you to hear it. But if you hear it differently, when you speak it back to me, you can share to me how what that story means to you. And now you have become the new narrator, and I get to accept that because you have the freedom to share, and I have the freedom to accept that and listen to what you share.
Yeah. So when we come to a place of sharing stories, when we walk with young people to a place of them especially publicly sharing their story or releasing their story, there does have to be a trust that the Holy Spirit is alive and active in this world, and that the reading of that story, the hearing of that story, the reception of that story is doing something good that maybe even the storyteller never fully intended or didn't even think about in the moment. Thank you so much for that. And I see another hand. Thomas. Thomas, did you have any?
Yes. Well, me, I would say is the increasing aware, become increasingly aware. So in my way, when we deal with youth, we like to make them to think deeply. So I think in a way, we can make the youth think deeply about the circumstances, situations that they face. So to me, I would say about the increasingly aware, that would prefer to be saying as to think deeply, or second level of thought of the youth to increase their awareness or their life steps.
Okay. So Thomas is highlighting the way becoming increasingly aware shows a sort of growth in thinking, self-reflection, but also reflection about what's happening in the world, and that it's a guide that's going somewhere. It's not just staying. Now, sometimes you do have to sit for a bit. Sometimes you have to sit for a while. And that's something I do think it's important to remember. We're doing, a quick presentation. Critical storytelling can be a year-long process. It can be a 3-year-long process. But the goal is forming beloved community. And I will say that sometimes that in that work of becoming increasingly aware, you don't fully know that you're there till you're there. It's kind of like when you are flying in a plane, you don't always know when you crossed over to the next state, but when you're there, you're there. It's a similar kind of thing. There's a place of like, wow, we are committed to each other. Wow, this life together is doing something different. That's pushing back against the attempts to hide the realities of racism or erase the realities of racism from our vision, or put a pause on the meaningful work that it takes to dismantle racism. Okay, thank you, everybody. That was great. Sometimes when I talk about this, or just anything that sometimes uses that term critical, there sometimes is that question, like, what is really meant by the term critical? And I just thought I'd explain that here. Critical storytelling. This is talking about storytelling that leads to important why, how, and what now questions about the world and the storyteller's sense of vocation. Okay, so it's critical in that sense that it's asking questions that's coming at it from different angles. Okay, sort of self-awareness, looking at social location, looking at society with a continual sort of angle shifting. Storytelling that helps name and diagnose brokenness, injustices, limits in our imagination, and how the beloved community calls us to see problems and possibilities that often go unseen. So similar to how it's asking these angle type of questions, it's also critical in the sense of it being, well, you can even say like important, asking the kinds of questions and telling the stories that name critical conditions. And then 3, storytelling, critical storytelling is storytelling that helps critique oppressive ideologies and practices. So there is a level of critique that takes place in critical storytelling. However, critical storytelling is not about critiquing or criticizing one another, but it does have room for critiquing oppressive ideologies and practices. Okay. All right. Who can do this? Who in a congregation or in an organization, who can do this? Young people can do it. Adults can, mentors, leaders, newcomers, ultimately everyone. When done well, this is actually an intergenerational kind of thing. It's an opportunity for people across generations to share and to learn from one another. That in itself is a move towards beloved community. But this can happen as a whole organization, a whole congregation. It can happen in smaller groups. It can begin, the process can begin one-on-one. What can critical storytelling be about? It can be about personal experiences. It can be about collective experiences. It can be about happenings in the congregation or an organization or the nonprofit or the community. It can also be about happenings in society. Critical storytelling has the ability to bring in all kinds of stories of all kinds of angles, but there is a particular kind of goal that's in mind. One is to challenge our complacency with the status quo, with new ways of seeing and sensing. We do this because it connects with the narrative way in which human beings make meaning. Amidst all kinds of complexities, human beings make meaning through story, through narrative. Oftentimes when young people are finding that there is a gap in how to connect their faith with this work to resist racism, it's oftentimes because they're not seeing how it fits in the story, or they're not seeing how the story that they are a part of connects with this story of faith. And so doing critical storytelling starts to open up space for the ways human beings make meaning. But then, perhaps most important, is that it meets young people at their 3 primary questions. Recently, there was a book by Kara Powell and Brad Griffin. It's called The 3 Big Questions, and I had the opportunity to be a part of that research team. And what we found is that young people in congregations all over the United States from different backgrounds, they have 3 primary questions that they're asking in their adolescent lives. And that's, who am I? Where do I fit? And what difference can I make? Who am I? Where do I fit? And what difference can I make? If you are working with young people in some capacity, it is very likely that one, if not all three of these questions center much of what I was just saying that the goal is to connect with students' questions, that if you're working with young people in any capacity right now, it's likely that they're asking one or all of these questions. Who am I? Where do I fit? And what difference can I make? And that the goal is to cultivate discernment, belonging, and agency. And that critical storytelling has this at its heart. If we're engaged in the work of discerning story together and cultivating story, and it's not moving, if it's not engaging young people at these questions, who am I? Where do I fit? What difference can I make? Then it's not the kind of storytelling that we have in mind for this particular practice. Okay. Once again, I want to just highlight that from a Kingian take, all of this stuff becomes important on the basis that the divine, that God is active in this world. Many times, and this is something that I found in the research for Church in Color, sometimes it's easy for congregations to assume that certain stories are just too edgy or too much dealing with complicated kinds of issues, that they don't really belong in church walls. That church can be a place where you don't have to think about a lot of those things, like systemic racism or some public examples of racism, or like daily happenings in the schools, like that kind of thing. But if we were to take a Kingian take and something actually connected with faith traditions, that God is alive both within church walls, both within the organization's walls and beyond it, then that makes room for recognizing that the stories don't need to be locked out, and actually can't be locked out, because the stories are connected to people who are interacting with that same very Holy Spirit who's alive in their lives. And so the stories are permeating. And so because of that, we can welcome in the kinds of stories that come from experiences that many may assume are God-forsaken. Okay. We are now going to move to this breakout discussion. And I believe the groups are already set up to go. So the questions are, what aspects of critical storytelling do you find most intriguing or most important? Share about an experience in your life or in your ministry context that has led to critical storytelling. Now, some of you may be thinking, I never even heard of critical storytelling until 20 minutes ago. Well, that's okay. You can share about an experience in your life or in your context that seems to be something like critical storytelling, okay? So this is just an opportunity just to kind of gauge where each other is and see how you're tracking so far, okay? So you can head out to those groups. All right, well, hopefully you had enough time to have a little bit of conversation. As we all know, sometimes breakout rooms can be too long, so I tried to err on the side of it being a little too short, with the hope of there being a little bit of insight that maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 people could share, just something that you either heard in the breakout room that you thought, oh, okay, I'm going to share this, even if I didn't say it, I'm going to share it. Or maybe you said something so amazing that you're like, I have to share this with everybody. I don't know. I'll leave it up to you. So go ahead and throw your hands in the air, and then I will call on you. Your hands, the digital hands, I should say.
Folks, just a reminder, the digital hands can be found in reactions. If you look in reactions on my screen, it's in the bottom left, or bottom right rather, and you'll see raise hand there.
Thank you, Jill. Susan, yes.
Well, I actually, I'm going to just say what I said very quickly. And I was going back to what I highlighted in the definition and its own voices. And I basically was saying how difficult it is for me to be sure that my teenagers are speaking with their own voice, and they're not speaking, and they're not afraid to speak outside without representing their mother's and father's view, basically. That's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is a time in their lives often when they are trying to make those distinctions.
Right.
And sometimes it's not always about saying, I don't care what my parents think, but it's even saying, now it's not just about what they think. Like, this is a part of me now. Like, and I want to name it in my own way. Thank you so much. I saw another hand. I think it was Kimberly, but if you...
Yes, it was me.
Okay.
Mine is kind of unique. It was a prison ministry experience. And typically, even though they're adults, a lot of the women in that ministry were locked up as children. So they still have the mindset that they had as a youth, thinking, this is the end for me. I've messed up my entire life. So I used the story of Jacob to kind of engage in critical storytelling. And it was very opening, because the series started with Who Am I? So we were able to unpack Jacob and get them to open up and be very transparent about, oh, well, yeah, I can see where I was like Jacob when I did this or that. And we're now unpacking that to become, okay, well, where did that come from? What is the root of that tree? And now developing the fruit of, yes, he was a trickster, but mainly because he was loyal to his mom. But how do we take that loyalty and make good fruit out of it? So
okay.
It worked in prison too. And that was before I even know what critical storytelling was.
Yeah, and that connects to something that we'll talk about towards the end here. That's great. Thank you so much. We might have to come back and do a Q&A with you. So, is there anyone else that just wanted to share an insight? It doesn't have to be something that is groundbreaking, just something you shared or something somebody shared. If you're thinking, I do want to share something, I just don't know how to do this digital hand thing, can you just quickly throw your hands up? Let me see.
Or folks, if you can unmute yourselves, that's worked in this setting as well. Feel free to do that.
Okay, I think Emily has a hand up. Yes.
Yeah, I was just making a comment about creating that safe space for the vulnerability for the storytelling, and just thinking about how we can do that better.
Yes, for sure. Obviously, if you're trying to engage in meaningful, critical storytelling, you do want it to be a place where, well, first of all, listeners aren't afraid of the stories, because that creates a whole lot of a dangerous situation. But also, you want to make sure that the people who are listeners are not people who are going to misuse those stories. That we know that is something that can happen in church life. And just in organizations that work with young people, not everybody is there for the best reasons. And so clearly, if you want to engage in this work, you want to do some of those typical things that hopefully you're already doing, like background checks and all of that. But then you also want to make sure that you're not, that you are offering a bit of content warning. So if you are a facilitator and you are getting into some of the practices that we'll talk about in a moment, and you have discerned, like, well, we're about to talk about something here that could send some people into a place that's not going to be, that this is not going to work well for them, then you want to be able to offer that kind of warning. You want to be able to create that kind of space, and every context is different. And so that's why I try to have these conversations like this. I'm not the biggest fan of, here's the cookie cutter, go do it exactly like this. You do need to know your space well. And so, Emily, I thank you so much for that, for raising that. And Thomas, and then we'll move to the next thing.
Actually, for coming here is the first time I heard the title of storyteller. But actually, we also we have done many programs like this. And as I lived in India for 7 years, so we have also done this type of program for Indian youth, and to tell a story from the Bible to bring out to a Hindu crowd is something that was very taskful, but we were able to mobilize our programs, and a lot of even Hindus were able to receive salvation. So when I hear you talk about the storytelling, for us, for the youth, we believe that three things are lacking. One is the deep thinking, self-control, and then the communication of the heart. So when we focused on those three things, as we did on these type of programs in India, Africa, and so forth. But I believe that the way you titled it as storyteller, but we titled it a little bit differently. But anyways, I think it's like same task or same motive. So as I was listening, I just felt very encouraged and saying, oh, this is a very good way to bring it out as a storyteller. Because in India, we can't say it as storytelling because if you say it like that, already India has their own ways of story of the Hindu gods and stuff like that. But we had to title it a little bit differently. But as I listen, I can see that people, when they deal with the youth, we have to focus on that type of reaction.
Right.
So
thank you, Thomas. I think one thing that I hear highlighted out of there is that there's a room for interfaith dialogue. And when we do critical storytelling well, we can do it in a way that highlights injustice in our communities and in our lives across differences. And I think that is really important. I want to highlight for you some ways that, sorry, I'm going to mute myself so I can cough. 1 second. I'm going to highlight some examples and pathways to critical storytelling that I've engaged in. And my hope is that what it does for you is inspire you to think about your own context. What I'm sharing here will not be for you to do exactly, okay? But we'll do another breakout room and hopefully you'll get to share a little bit about like, okay, now wait a second. I can do this in this way, okay? One thing that I do is lead pilgrimages. In fact, there was potentially going to be another chapter in Church in Color where I talk specifically about a particular pilgrimage that I led, but it just was getting too long. So it's actually published as an article in Religious Education Journal called Holy Communion on Canfield Drive. I do apologize if you hear noise in the hallway of my office here. Someone's birthday out there. So I wrote an article called Holy Communion on Canfield Drive, and that is an article that describes a pilgrimage that I had the opportunity to lead, where we took a group of young people across various lines of difference to the site where Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And that work was all about engaging people who are on the ground, working there, living there, leaders there. It wasn't about going to make a claim about something that we were doing to change anywhere. It was really a trip about learning and listening and learning how to pray well. And together that group wrote a liturgy, a communion liturgy. But we engaged people on the ground there. And I had the opportunity in years prior to get to know some leaders on the ground. So in many ways, I invited them into that work. But what that led to was a great deal of self-reflection and reflection on their own cities. So where each of the young people came from, when they learned about particular public policies around policing or public policies around residential neighborhood or municipality arrangements. The pilgrimage back was a pilgrimage to becoming aware of how this is not just about one city, but this is all over the United States. And so it opened up a great deal of storytelling about one's own city. And part of this work also required young people to learn the stories of different people of color who were killed at the hands of law enforcement, and to understand their stories. It wasn't a trip that went to go make a statement. It was a trip that was about learning and honoring the people who were on the ground working there and leading there. Okay. Something that I do now that I'm in Southern California, I haven't always been here, but I've been here for the last 5 years. So one thing that I do now regularly is lead trips to the border for this gathering that happens every Sunday called Border Church. And basically we meet at the fence, at the area of the border where the fence runs right out into the Pacific Ocean. And we gather via Bluetooth speaker and have a worship gathering. There are people on the US side and people on the Mexico side. And it's a bilingual service. It's led bilingually. And we participate in communion there. What you see in front of you is a picture of actually the current state of things. So it used to be the case that we could walk into that gate, see that first gate, and then there's another fence. So if you walk into that first gate, you're in what's called Friendship Park, which was actually set up to be a binational park where people can go and meet with relatives that they haven't seen in a while and talk through that taller fence that's there, that the darker fence that you see towards the lighthouse. That people would sit right there and talk through that. It's not very much space to see through. It's like tiny holes really like that, but it was a place for community. And slowly and more slowly, I guess you can say slower and slower, there was a shift to have fewer and fewer people in there. And then now you're not really allowed in there at all. So now the gathering happens at a greater distance. We actually use phone and mics to talk and sing together and share together. And I took this picture as a way of conjuring a sense of wrestling, to give a sense of like what it's like to be there, the images that are around when you are engaged in a worship gathering. Going to that place opened up a great deal of conversation. Like, what is a border? What makes it real? Is it real? What about the fact that it goes out into the ocean and then stops? What do you do with that water that's just shifting back and forth? What about the sky that's shared in this space? Like, what is happening here? And it brings stories. This often leads to stories of young people telling about, their family and migration stories. It often leads to people coming to terms with forced separation. It leads to stories around, does it have to be this way? The does it have to be this way question is what this experience brings up. And then that leads to some exploration. Okay. We can come back to that in the Q&A if you'd like. These experiences and other experiences, with these kinds of experiences and other experiences, I often guide young people to write prayers, liturgy, sometimes personal prayers, but what I find really impactful is guiding in writing call and response prayers. Because now to do that, you have to engage stories. You have to learn how people are encountering this space. You have to bring more than your own take because you're inviting people to read along with you, to be a part of this prayer as well. And so if there is a goal of writing a prayer or writing some sort of call and response, then now we are breaking open the call for story. So I generally do this with like Eucharistic prayers, Lord's Prayer. I often lead workshops on engaging the Lord's Prayer from a particular point or site, bringing a collective story to that. Serenity prayer can be used that way. And then prayers of lament. It's very impactful because that calls for a deep reflection on story. Once again, we can go deeper in the Q&A if you'd like. Here's another practice that I have found to be very helpful. Journalists have a major task. Their task is to tell, who in a story, what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, why did the person do the thing, at least as far as we know, in an objective sense, and how did that thing take place. Journalism doesn't go beyond that. Now, you might have op-eds that go beyond that, but generally, journalism doesn't go beyond that. But what we do in the work of discipleship and formation, we are empowering young people to be interpreters of the world. We're empowering young people to be interpreters of situations. So we get to go beyond the questions of journalism. We get to appreciate and be thankful for good journalism, but then we get to ask questions like, how come? How come? We get to ask deepening why questions regarding unjust systems, like, how did that get started in the first place? Or why were those the only two options? Why? Like, okay, they're just following the law. Like, why is that the law? Like, where did that come from? When did that start? We get to ask questions like, what could be done differently? What should be done differently? What may be needed to change a particular situation? We get to ask, where is God in this situation? We get to ask, how can our congregation be present here? So I put up, New York Times, but I also put up the New Haven Register newspaper, assuming that somebody in New Haven reads the local paper where Yale is. But there's all kinds of journalism, all kinds of things to connect with there. And this can be a regular process, like even like once every 3 months, within whatever program you have. Like once every 3 months, we're going to do news interpretation. Everyone's going to bring an article, and they're going to share with the group, like who, the what, the when, the where, the attempted objective why, the attempted objective how, that's in the article, and then we're going to go deeper. And you can even ask young people to do that before they come. And after you summarize that, we want you to think the next level. Engage in that work that we get to engage in as people of faith. We get to engage in those questions of interpretation. That is ultimately what we're doing. That's ultimately what we're doing when we're doing discipleship and formation, is we are preparing young people to be interpreters in the world. Okay. So this then leads to a great deal of storytelling, because it's going to lead to exploration, and you can't get it done in just, like a really quick conversation. This now calls for some exploration. It calls for learning about a situation, doing some research. If you do this specifically with like a local newspaper, or local news, or local happenings, it allows young people to get to know their place, not like where they belong, and that's like know your place, but get to know the space that they inhabit. They get to know their city, they get to know their town, they get to know the stories that are at play. And when we begin unearthing those stories, it's like, what do we do with them? Okay. Another thing that one can do is do some guided reflection on art. So like take this photo, for example. This would be a little bit more of a personal engagement for storytelling. It's in some ways a prompt to get one doing some deeper self-reflection without, starting out that way. So for a photo like this, what is happening here? If the person in the photo were you and lived your life this week or this year, what would they be thinking about? What questions do they have? Now, if you engage in something like this with young people, you do need to know that the immediate responses may not be very detailed. And so one key thing you can do in the conversation, instead of saying okay, well, how about this? How about this? How about that? You could just say, I'd love to hear more about that. Can you tell me more? I'd love to hear more about that. Can you tell me more? Now you might be thinking, this is a strange practice. So let's just take a minute and try it. I'll give you a minute and I want you to write it down. What is happening here? I'll make it bigger for you. What is happening here? Just go ahead and jot it down. What is happening here? You don't have to write out long paragraphs because we're doing this quickly just for the sake of the presentation. If the person in this photo were you and lived your life this week or this year, you choose, what would they be thinking about? Now, I'm not going to open up the space for everybody to share about this, only because I don't know where it'll go. And it would be dishonest for me to tell you that we have the room to engage where that conversation could go. Also, I only gave you a few minutes to do this, but if you were to do something like that with young people, it does begin the storytelling, especially if you follow up with things like, I'd like to hear more about that. One thing that I found when I was doing the research for Church in Color is that there were all kinds of attempts young people make to try to tell the stories that they experience and the questions they have regarding racism. But because of a lot of the blocks and church talk that sometimes we have, it's hard for young people to get that in. They'll try all these different ways, but it often gets stopped somewhere. And it often comes through just weekly sharing and an attempt to share what happened during the week. But if you engage in a practice like this and you follow up, and sometimes it can be just in a circle of young people, and you follow up with, I'd love to hear more about that. Can you share more about that? Without it being an attempt to correct, you can go to some really important places. How do I know that? Because that's actually partly how I did my research. And I went to some really important places. And we got to hear a lot of important stories along the way. Here's another practice. You can reflect on family stories with race and racism. It's very simple, actually. It's simply asking young people to get to know their family stories and think about their family stories through the reality of race and racism in America. Here are some examples of where you could go with that. Where were my relatives when Emmett Till was killed? How were my great-great-grandparents affected by indigenous people being removed from their lands? What side of the Civil War did my family fight on? How did my family racially identify or associate after they immigrated to the United States? Why? These can lead to some very in-depth, sometimes hard to navigate, or what some might say hard to hear kinds of stories, but they get to some honest places. They get to those questions of unearthing some things that try to be hidden away. The problem is when we hide them away, it makes it very difficult to see and sense what's going on around us because the stories are being buried, but the effects of the stories are alive and well. And so this kind of practice is like, oh, like I see now. That's why we do it this way in our family. Like, oh my goodness, no one ever talks about that. Like, that's why we live in the neighborhood we live in. What do I think about that now? Like, oh my, that's why my family has that business. Like, oh, wow, what do I do with this? And it leads to the kind of storytelling that creates change, that creates honesty at the very least, and then change if we're open to it. I want to just give you quickly some other examples instead of going through in a detailed way, because we can just talk. Sorry, let me just do a quick pause here. You could do poetry prompts. There's some really great poetry prompts that you can do to get young people thinking. And if you're interested, we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. Testimony time used to be a thing that was very common in churches, at least in certain traditions like my own. It doesn't happen as much anymore, partly because the stories have often been about sharing how awesome things are. But perhaps testimony can be done in a way that's just sharing. Like, this is what's going on in my life. And this is how I'm longing for God to be present in my life. And it doesn't have to be a, look what I made it, look how I made it through. It can be, look what I'm going through. And that opens up the door for the kind of honesty that young people can engage without having to get to some assumed place in where the story is supposed to end. You can engage in storyboarding, which basically means having young people draw out aspects of their story given different kind of framings for how stories happen. Not every story is beginning, middle, end. Sometimes it's beginning, middle, and that middle has like all kinds of ups and downs, and you think it's over, but then you realize it's not, and new people come into the mix, and then it complicates, and sometimes that's helpful. And you can do storyboarding for like a young person's personal life, but then also for like what's happening in my community. I think Kimberly, who was earlier, was talking about engaging scripture through story, and that's definitely something that I've seen to be very helpful, which is having a circle of young people come around narratives with the goal of just interrogating the narratives and naming out loud how it connects to aspects of their stories. I've seen this done in a variety of ways. And then sometimes story circles can then turn into like performance. It could even be welcomed into like sermon prep. It could be used as like sermon prep for like writing a sermon, but also like what happens right before a sermon is preached. It can be used for for actual like creation of standalone performances like skits. So what do you do with critical storytelling? When you engage these pathways and you begin to make room for the kinds of stories and reflections that often are hidden, what do we do? Well, remember, the goal is to cultivate discernment, belonging, and agency. Something that's so important to do is to communicate belief. One of the major shutdowns for critical storytelling is a young person sensing like, you probably are not believing what I'm saying. And sometimes that lack of belief is communicated through some really annoying questions. Like, how do you know what they meant when they did that? It's like, oh, okay. Like, I wasn't trying to tell you I know what that meant. I was trying to tell you what happened to me, And it's like, and we're done. And that's a common thing that I found in my research. It's like a lot of that. Like, I tried to tell, they didn't seem like they believed, so I'm not here for that. So communicate belief, follow up, make sure that it's not just a story that's told and then like lost in the air. Like if it's something that is a critical storytelling, then follow up. Let young people know that you remember it, that you're interested in making room for it. If it leads to the kind of work that's wondering about making change in a city, in a neighborhood, explore local organizations together. Sometimes churches forget that there are people in a city who are really engaged, and there are hubs of people who are very committed to particular matters. And rather than reinventing a wheel, you can find ways to partner up. And you can do that together with young people, help young people understand that network of people working for justice and change. Explore local laws and policy changes together. Include the stories, with young people's permissions, of course, into the life of the congregation and community. Rather than it just being their personal side hidden story, if they're open, if they see something happening in their community and they're able to connect their lives to it, remember, the Holy Spirit is alive and well, both beyond the walls and within the walls of the church. That means this person is slowly welcoming that story into the congregation's story and asking the congregation, well, where are we going to be? How are we going to respond? Make room for the stories to be told again and even develop. And then, depending on your role, like you might want to explore theological questions. Perhaps this raises questions around how God is present, how we interpret certain aspects of Scripture. What does this mean in light of a faith tradition? Okay. I do have a breakout discussion, but I think I'm going to skip the breakout discussion just because we're done in like 15 minutes, correct? Okay. So what I'll do, I cannot find that mute button, but I have to cough so bad. That is so interesting. There it is. One second. Yeah. I'll leave these questions live. So which of these critical storytelling practices can you imagine doing in your own context? And has any portion of the congregation here conjured new ideas for your own ministry context? I'll leave that live for you to think about. Maybe we can have that put in the chat. But I will also just open this for Q&A at this point. So I'll begin by calling on Christian. Let me also say, if you have something to share, just recognize, like, I really want to hear from you, and I think everybody would enjoy hearing from you, but also recognize that if you share for more than like 30 seconds, it starts to feel too long on a Zoom. I know that sounds really annoying for me to say, but it's true. So I just wanted to name that.
And I'll just add one quick thing. If you have a question and we don't get to it in the next 15 minutes, I'm very blessed to get some additional time with Montague. So I will get a chance to ask that question separately. Feel free to put it in the chat or drop me an email. Thanks.
Okay. So Christian.
First of all, thank you for all of this. This is so it's just good stuff. But I'm wondering, like I'm thinking in my own context, my own tradition, like the majority of people at my parish, for example, are like white Americans. And I can imagine that any kind of conversation that would lead toward empowering young people to tell critical stories such as these, and I'm even imagining, like from just in 2020 with like everything surrounding the pandemic, like we ended up leaving our church because it was very much clear that you could not have a critical story to tell and to have it received. In the beginning you said it necessitates narrators and listeners. So I guess what I'm wondering about is what do you like? How does one navigate the space when there isn't that and? Like there's one or the other. It's kind of like you just have to do what you're told and listen to what leadership is saying,
Mm-hmm.
or you're narrating and no one's open to it.
Yes, this is a great question. Oh, I was asked to stop my screen share. Okay, I will. There we go. That's helpful. Okay. Yes. There are a couple things to think about there. One, there's a need to recognize that, resisting injustice and bringing awareness to injustice is part of the church's call. It's part of it's not just a side thing. It's part of the church's call. And recognizing that, we also find that being rejected is part of what happens. It's not just going to be easy. What I find the most encouraging, and this is just one angle to go, but I find it so encouraging that Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to send you out 2 by 2, go talk about the kingdom, what King would call the beloved community. And if people accept it, like, this is great. If not, shake the dust off your sandals and move on. Okay? Because sometimes you got to shake the dust off your sandals. And it sounds, Christian, like maybe you've done that. Maybe you're like, okay, in the one space, I'm going to shake the dust off the sandals. I've been faithful here. And my prayer is that somebody else will come knocking and be faithful too. But if you sense that burden of calling to go to the next house, go. That's one. It's okay to shake the dust. Jesus said to do it when you need to do it. So the other thing, though, is sometimes you sense a different kind of call, which is, I have got to walk with these people. I've got to walk with these people. I'm going to meet these folks where they are, and I'm going to walk with these people. And that then requires a great deal of strategy of how you include these stories. So in that sense, you're now you are like sort of like covert operation kind of deal. So, I mean, you're including stories like in bits and pieces, like I remember I once had to do that. You bring in a story in a sermon about something that's happened in the neighborhood that no one in the congregation really even wants to think about. And you just tell the story. If it connects with what you're doing with that passage and with that time in the churches, like in like the calendar, liturgical calendar, if you follow that, you just bring that in. Or if it's an organization that is trying to discern, if you're leading an organization and you're trying to discern how to like pivot the focus, you just bring those stories in. You say, I was in conversation with a group of young people in our neighborhood, and I got to hear this story. And we engaged in some practices that I heard at this event, and we tried it out, and it kind of led to some really important things. And I'd love for us to just take it further and learn a little bit more about how we can be present. Like, it may or may not change our mission statement or like what we do for the next year or our vision for the next 5 years. It may or may not, but it seems like we ought to engage this conversation for a moment. And that would be one way, just to kind of bring it in and then be open, because the Holy Spirit is alive and active in this world. And you don't have to like put your, you don't have to grasp the whole thing. I'm trusting that God's alive and active. I guess that's my quick take on that. Of course, for all of these answers, it does require knowing your space a bit. I had the opportunity to, work in pastoral life myself, but then also my research engaged congregations very specifically. And so if I say anything and you're like, but that does not fit where I am, it's like, okay, I do apologize. I'm not where you are, but hopefully.
No, that's really great. Thank you very much.
Monte, several folks had a question in the chat above a little bit ago about how to access your article, Holy Communion on Canfield Drive. And I had a link in there, but there's a paywall. So didn't know if you had a better way for folks to get in touch with that work.
Okay. So I was probably about to share the same link that has a paywall. Let me just say it does have a paywall, but I don't know what if you all are members with the Yale Divinity School in terms of the continuing education, but that article, you can access it online through any library that has like online database kind of search. If you go to ATLA, your digital, if you go to your public library and do a digital journal search, it's in the journal called Religious Education. And that's an international journal. It's widely distributed, and Yale certainly has access to it through their library systems. And that way you get the PDF downloaded for free.
Folks, we'll look into that and follow up with an email on details of that. Thanks.
I think Amy had a question or a thought.
You mentioned earlier about poetry prompts. That just piqued my interest. I wondered if you had some specific suggestions.
Yeah. So one thing that you can do, and this is actually a form of poetry, is to take headlines and get certain headlines, like different articles, and have people pick a certain amount of words. Like you get to pick 20 words. Pick 20 words and write a poem with that. Now, what's interesting about that is generally if you're picking words for like a certain kind of article, if it's about, like an international war, or if it's about a local shooting or a new housing development, I think that's happening right now in New Haven, actually. I was actually considering bringing an example, but I figured we'd run out of time, which we did. You can then have young people just write a poem on whatever they want. And then from there, try to then go through that article and see if their poem in any way connects to the article. Now, generally, when people write poetry, it has something to do with their lives or what they're thinking about or wondering about. So when you do that, it opens up the door to be like, well, how does what I'm thinking about, as I pull words randomly from this article, how does that connect with what's actually happening in my community? So that's one example. There's also another form of poetry called Ecrastic Poetry, which is very interesting. It actually makes use of, so like how I showed you some artwork. It would be writing a poem based on reflection. So how I showed you, for example, the sitting for a sunset picture. instead of just asking those questions, you can ask those questions and then say, write a poem about that. Or you could say, here's a picture. I want you to write a poem. Let's see where it goes. And that opens up space for poetry. There's another form of poetry called the golden shovel, which I find to be just really helpful in these kinds of things. And it would be, for example, you take a quote. You could even take like a quote from somebody in the community, or maybe there's like a common phrase like in your own group. And then you take every word of that quote, like a shorter quote, and you make it the last word of every line. So if the quote was, for example, thanks, Elizabeth, glad to see you on here, because I just read that in the chat, then the last word in the first line would be thanks. The last word in the second line would be Elizabeth. The last word in the third line would be glad. You get it? Go all the way down. That's the golden shovel form. And what you can do with that is provides a quote that has meaningful, it's like a meaningful, reflective kind of quote. And then say, write your own golden shovel and try to connect with the meaning of the quote, making use of your own reflection. And you could even like open up space, like try to make use of this quote in a golden shovel poem. And I challenge you to write that poem while reflecting on something that just happened in our neighborhood, or something that just took a decision that was made that we all feel very frustrated about, or that we all wonder about. And it opens up that space. Now people are talking about their poetry, they're asking questions, they're doing the kinds of things. Remember, art conjures new imagination. So now they're like getting to say things without having to just write it, like make an argument, you know? Those are some examples. There's also, if you're doing Zoom Live, there's a website where you can go and do the, you know how sometimes you have those like word magnets? It's like all these words like on a fridge. There's a website where you can like go to like click on it and it like randomizes word magnets. And so you can just like, if you're doing like a Zoom gathering, you could be like, okay, I'm going to challenge everyone to click that 5 times. Now, whatever you have, you work with those words, or click it 5 times. And on each click, you have to pick 3 words and then write from there and try to connect it with this particular story that we've been wrestling with together. You know, that's one way to do that.
Folks, I have to honor our time and thank Reverend Dr. Williams for joining us in this season and this session. So grateful for all of this. If you have questions we didn't get to yet, please do feel free to email me at jill.olds@yale.edu. That's in the chat. And we'll look forward to seeing you folks again. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for all of this.
My
And folks,
pleasure.
thank you.
So great to be with all of you. Thank you for your comments and your questions along the way. They're great. Thank you. Fabulous.